It's been 4 years since the tragedy occurred at Mother Emanuel AME Church here in downtown Charleston. And 4 years later, notable attorney Andy Savage tells me exclusively that his client and Mother Emanuel victim, Felicia Sanders, has not received a dime. I speak exclusively with Andy for a special edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And be sure to download the free Quintin's Close-Ups app in your Apple or Google Play stores. And of course, subscribe to my YouTube channel and later listen to this interview on iHeartRadio. Andy Savage, it is so good to see you again.
Always glad to be with you.
I appreciate it here on Quintin's Close-Ups. I got to come to some developing news with you because obviously the remembrance of the Mother Emanuel tragedy 4 years later is coming up soon. And I know that you wanted to bring this to my attention. June 17, 2015, the world donated millions to the church for the benefits of the victims. But where did the donations go? And I understand that three of your clients never got a penny.
Well, that's not exactly correct. The monies were donated to the church, but for the victims. The church itself is not a victim. The church is a building. It's the people who attend the church that are the real church. So when this money came in, you have to consider that the church had never experienced anything like this before. So money was just pouring in from every type of location. A lot of it came in actually in envelopes addressed to either the church or to the victims. They were named.
Right.
But clearly the intent was for those people who survived the shooting and for those who lost loved ones as a result of the shooting. So time went on, and eventually the church divided up the funds according to their own criteria.
Right.
And each estate of the victims who were killed received a pretty substantial amount of money. Polly Shepard, who was one of the survivors, received a like amount. So there was a decision made how much money to give, of what was collected, and who knows what portion of that was of the monies collected. There were millions of dollars collected.
Sure.
The families received $150,000 each, as did Miss Shepard. The 11-year-old child who lived because her grandmother covered her with her body
Right.
while the shots were being fired, while her uncle was murdered right in front of her, whose blood spilled all over her, whose Auntie Susie, who was murdered right in front of her, whose blood and bodily fluids spilled all over her and covered her body. She and her grandmother, Felicia Sanders, who the brass casings of the bullets hit her on the leg repeatedly and burned her leg, and who was covered in the blood of her loved ones, received nothing. And why am I bringing this up now? It's because I've lived with Felicia, who is my friend for 35, 40 years before this even happened, who's closer to me than my own blood sister. Felicia is as close as I could be to anybody. So I've lived with the sorrow and the pain, it's not just a financial thing, as you might know. I mean, think about these people. They were at church because that was their life. And Felicia was there with her son who was murdered, her Auntie Susan, and her granddaughter who she wanted to bring up in the church. Felicia is a 7th generation member of Emanuel.
Right.
The granddaughter is a 9th generation member. Tawanza, who lost his life, was an 8th generation member. These are not fly-by people who came to Emanuel just to grab a hot dog on a Wednesday evening. These people were there in a serious matter of Bible study,
Right.
that they went to every week. And this slaughter took place. I was with Felicia in her home basically for 2 weeks after the shooting, waiting and waiting for somebody from the church to come and address her spiritual needs. just didn't happen. It was a struggle just to arrange for the funeral services. In fact, we had to reach out to the all-white Presbyterian church in order to accommodate the needs of the family. It was just unbelievable, but the time wasn't right at that time to express any dissension. And the time really hasn't been right until now. And the reason I'm bringing this to the public's attention at this time is because this precious, beautiful child, who may have suffered more than anyone else, if that's possible, is now in a long-term care facility out of state at some distance, some 1,500 miles away, to handle the repercussions of this event. And the church, Emanuel Church and its leadership, has turned its back on this child, just as they have her grandmother. And the world needs to know that. Those people who gave millions of dollars in donations should know that the church and its leadership elected not to share that with two of the most vulnerable and damaged individuals of this event. It's outrageous.
Why did their church forsake them in your mind?
You know, there might be those that might consider it greed. I really can't imagine. I just don't know. But it started on day one. It started on a spiritual ignorance of the people in need at that church. The very fact that Nadine Collier, who was the first one to stand up at the bond hearing and say, "We forgive you," ignored by the leadership, to the extent that she had to go. You will recall the first funeral was not held at Emanuel.
Right.
It's not because she didn't want it to be there. It's because the church leadership just ignored the needs of these people. And it's time to call them out on that. It's time to call out the pastor. It's time to call out the leadership of the pastor, the 7th district, who made the decisions in terms of spiritual need and financial assistance.
I know that Nadine Collier and a couple other people basically forgave this particular guy who did this awful thing at Mother Emanuel. Tough question for you. 4 years later, do you forgive him?
I would like to forgive them. Probably somebody with my orientation towards life of, what I do for a living, and understanding the needs of people. But this young man was evil. And I can't separate him from the evil. If I'm ever able to accomplish that, to separate him and look at him as a human being with a lot of faults from the evilness, but he's so evil. It's not just what he manifested on June 17th. It was through all the trials and tribulations of the legal process in which his evilness just rose to the surface. His hatred for his own attorneys, his abuse of his own attorneys, his racial remarks of his own attorneys, his anti-Semitic venom that he expressed and still expresses. It's very hard for me to forgive him until he genuinely asks for forgiveness, either spiritually or secularly, by apologizing and accepting his responsibility for this terrible situation. I think at that time I might be more inclined to forgive him, but to answer your question, no, I don't.
Let me turn over to Michael Slager. As you know, the United States Supreme Court basically said, hey, no, we're not going to look at this case right now.
Mm-hmm.
How did we get here in your mind?
How do we what?
How did we get here?
To get where?
With Michael Slager not being able to hear from the United States Supreme Court.
Well, Michael was the victim in a sense. Now, I don't want the Scott family to be disparaged in this, but in a different context, Michael was a victim. Michael was the victim of an act that had emotionally, the public at that time was so outraged by acts of others, white policemen, in much more egregious circumstances, who killed or injured or maimed young black men or black men in general. So there was this, it was in New York City, it was in Louisiana, it was in Georgia, it was in Michigan and Minnesota, it was out west. All these different instances of white policemen and black men being shot. It was a scourge on our dignity of our country and our respect for one another. He just happened to be the one where they said, we got him, and boy, are we going to teach him a lesson. So what got him was this snippet of a video that I believe was grossly misinterpreted and emphasized some actions but didn't give us a timeline, didn't give us the fact that this Mr. Scott was stopped for a nothing offense that the city of North Charleston required its police officers to do as part of what they call community policing. You would stop somebody, not to give them a ticket, but in this case it was a safety violation, a brake light that wasn't working. He would never have gotten a ticket for Michael Slager under any circumstances. The worst he would have been told was, hey, here's an auto parts store, the one inside, spend 35 cents. So in that process that the department wanted him to, as they said, community policing, that was their way of doing it. Sort of bizarre, because every time a blue light goes on behind me, I panic, right? It's not conducive to a good relationship, but nonetheless, that was their modus operandi. He had no, think about it. On a quiet morning, 9:30 in the morning, and then what happened? Well, Mr. Scott ran. Well, the antennas then went up. Something's amiss here. A very minor stop. Somebody's running away. And then it was the running away coupled with the physical resistance. Now, you can argue that all you want, the extent of the physical resistance, the use of force progression that Slager employed, that Mr. Scott ignored or repressed. So you went from verbal commands, presence, verbal commands, the use of a taser, attempted use of a taser. None of that seemed to stop him or slow him down or say, hey, I've had enough. And then when he actually put his hands on him, the physical resistance, the fighting for it, all that was just absolutely ignored. That's what differentiated it from all the other cases around the country. But what did you have? You had a video of 8 or 10 seconds that on its face was awful. Make the hair on my neck stand up until you put it in the context of what happened. Did what he do, what he did, was it wrong? Absolutely it was wrong. Did he use excessive force? Absolutely he used excessive force. But it has to be proportionate to the incident. And 20 years is not proportionate. Even the state and the federal government at one point said, in the negotiation process, 10 years. The pre-sentencing report that was issued by the Probation Officer of the Year federally, the National Probation Officer of the Year, recommended much less than that. So that fight will continue just because the Supreme Court did not accept the appeal. That doesn't mean it's over. So in any criminal case, you have what we call direct appeal. That is, the judge made an error in judgment. Therefore, the case should be returned. In this case, we never challenged the guilt or innocence. We always admitted that he was guilty of excessive force. What we challenged was the proportionality of the sentence to the act performed. We don't now, nor did we ever believe it was murder. Did we believe it was excessive force? Yes. What does that mean in the category of manslaughter? Either involuntary or voluntary manslaughter, which means it's not an intentional act. I'm going to kill you, bam, for some other reason. There was nothing to do with hatred in this case. There's no history of discrimination in Mr. Slager's life. Quite the opposite. There's no history of excessive use of force by Mr. Slager when he was employed either in the Coast Guard or as a police officer. Quite the opposite. Working the hardest, most crime-ridden neighborhoods for his whole career. Having been in street fights before, never used excessive force. In fact, was told on many occasions he should have used more force to accommodate him, or people saying that I would have, that particular individual that reviewed the facts, I would have been justified using much more force. So the 20 years is really what's in my heart. It's not punishment. It's that the extraordinary over-punishment, given all the facts and circumstances of the case.
That direct appeal, what else would you appeal to?
So the next step legally would be to file what we call a 2255 motion. And that's the legal lawyers PCR. But that basically attacks what your lawyers did for you, and whether the lawyers gauged the case properly. And I readily admit to you, I was more shocked than Mr. Slager. So my calculation of his case and the way we approached it ought to be questioned. I don't blame Mr. Slager at all for saying, Andy, you didn't do a very good job for me, because I didn't. I mean, the results speak for themselves. In my mind, I thought that, I've never worked harder in a case in my life than that, but perhaps I made bad judgments. Certainly, if he wound up with 20 years and I pled him guilty, or I recommended him to plead guilty, that was on my back. It's not on his. I was his lawyer. I was giving him the advice that I thought was in his best interest. But, in the state case, remember,
right,
I thought that the solicitor's position was too strong. It's not that I didn't think he did anything wrong, or he didn't think he did anything wrong. But the calculation was, this is overproduced. You want him to plead guilty to murder. That's just not going to happen. He would plead guilty to something reasonable because he did something unreasonable, and he should be held accountable. So in the federal case, if I made an error in judgment, it was trusting the court to do what I thought was a reasoned sentence based on my analysis of the court's prior decisions, based on what I believe the pre-sentence report would be. All that was correct, but my analysis of how the judge would accept that was absolutely wrong.
I was talking with Dot Scott just yesterday, and she basically said, hey, I'm not letting this Denzel Cornell case go away.
Mm-hmm.
If you could go back 5 years ago to now, what would you do differently if you were still representing the family?
Well, Denzel's case, and I want the public to know what that was, it's a case of a young man who was depressed as a result of his mother's death. His mother had died from cancer the year before. He went into the Army. He was struggling in basic training, heavily burdened by this depression based on his mother's death, who came home, and as part of his psyche wanted to go back to where he lived with his mother, and went back to the apartments where he was. And he was confronted for no reason. I mean, a young black man walking in public space, confronted by a uniformed police officer who was working part-time as security. And you can imagine the type of approach that was made, an aggressive approach. There was a struggle, and the question was, the shot that was fired, was it intentional or not intentional? did he intentionally kill himself? Or did the policeman's interference and physical contact with him cause his death? So it was investigated by the State Law Enforcement Division, which I'm not a fan of, as you know. I think they really lack in terms of investigative ability. And a decision was made that it was a suicide. And I can understand that because of his depression and whatnot. But there was no sign at that moment. There was nothing going on in his life at that time that would indicate such a drastic response to depression. Okay. You know, a lot of people walk the streets of Charleston depressed. And again, it's all a matter of, are you a little depressed? Are you really depressed? You know, just to say somebody's depressed doesn't really tell you too much because it's so prevalent. But if somebody had threatened to kill themselves, or there was some letter that was written of their depth of their depression, but there was no such thing in this case. So the question is, what happened? Then when you start looking at it, there was a video camera right across the street. And it's supposed to be based on motion, so that if somebody walked in front of it, well, here you had a vehicle, the police vehicle, drive by it. You had the police officer there. You had the victim there, Cornell. You had a lot of motion and commotion over the ground fight, yet the video didn't record. It had recorded right before that, right after that. So there was a lot of questioning. What I did then was hire actually the same crime scene expert that I've used in a number of other cases, including Mr. Slager's. And he came down and thoroughly evaluated the case and made a determination that it couldn't be determined, that there was just not enough evidence either way of deciding what happened. So, you know, it's still out there, right? To me, it's still an unresolved case. I don't think Dot's alone in that. I think the family probably feels that way too. I think there have been some changes made in the City of Charleston Police Department, which I think are very helpful. I know that our new chief, who wasn't here at that time, is terrific. He's very tuned into community concerns. And the thing I expressed most to him was that this idea of being in a neighborhood and sitting in your vehicle is a terrible policy. You know, this officer was hired by the apartment complex to provide security. Well, he went down and sat in his police vehicle. He didn't get out. You know, if you're going to be the neighborhood guy, if you're going to be the go-to guy when there's a security issue, you want to know the people who live there. You know, get out of the vehicle, lock it up, get out, meet people, introduce yourself. You know, let people know that you're there to protect them, not to arrest them, not to give them a hard time, but to be a helping hand. And this new chief gets it. He understands that. And you will not see that type of division between police in a locked vehicle with the windows rolled up and the people they serve. You'll see a much more open interaction between law enforcement and the public it serves.
Was the coroner's investigation thorough in your mind?
Well, it was primarily a SLED investigation, and you know, I've never been a fan of SLED, and that comes from the leadership. You know, if you have a leader who has a certain opinion, let's say that opinion is the cop's always right, or for what political or whatever reason it is, because it gets up to the director of SLED, which is a very political position, as you know from the Slager case. But when you have a mindset, this was a suicide, for example, everything you find then goes into that category. That's the filter in which you see things. SLED has never had an objective viewpoint on any case that I've been involved in that they would consider something other. They start out with a position, guilt. They start out with a position, he did this, he did that, she did this, she did that. And then everything they collect, everything they do is to confirm that initial analysis. That's SLED. As opposed to the way it should be, that let's examine everything, let's view it from all perspectives, all viewpoints, and then make a decision. Most recently, look at Ken Bo's case down at the Citadel.
Yeah.
You know, an outrage. I mean, just, you know, SLED ought to be on their hands and knees begging for forgiveness and what they've done to that man's life. Absolutely destroyed him. You know, talking about Bo's and SLED, Bo's so-called victim, this young, basically thug who was a student at the Citadel, gave him the name of 3 students. He says to SLED, you go talk to these 3 people and they'll confirm that this is an abusive guy. They never talked to him. We did. And they all gave an extraordinary accolation about Ken Bowes and what a great guy he was and that he would never be involved in that type of misconduct. Those were named by the person who claimed that Bowes assaulted him. Those names were given to SLED. They prepared an 8,000-page report and never interviewed those 3 cadets. Because it didn't go along with what they projected to be their analysis of what happened.
To be continued.
Life goes on.
Oh, yeah. And how are you feeling? I mean, I read the article about you. How are you feeling physically, emotionally?
You know, that was talking about Cornell and depression.
Okay.
So I've suffered depression myself, and particularly at that time, after the illnesses that I had gone through, and then having 2 years of dedication to Michael Slager and the way I felt that he had been treated, and that I just couldn't convince people of what it did. And then we had this wonderful trial with the judge that was not particularly favorable to us, if you remember. Yet the jury came back and voted 12-0. You still see it on the Google machine that it was, you know, one person holding out. No, it wasn't one person. 12 jurors decided he was not guilty of murder. 8 of them couldn't decide on manslaughter. 4 of them out of the 12 thought he was guilty of manslaughter. 4 thought he was not guilty of anything. And 4 thought they needed more time to discuss. So after that, it was a tremendous, you know, we felt, boy, we finally got through to somebody. And going into federal court with the knowledge that he did use excessive force, right? I believe that he used excessive force. He could have gotten control. He could have done a number of other things, just wasn't thinking clearly at the time. Reactive thinking as opposed to proactive thinking. And we hold police to such a high standard on the street when there's a lot of movement going on. But thinking that, you know, we had really threaded the needle on this, and then, you know, the decision in federal court of 20 years knocked me back, took me to my knees. Took me a while to try to, what did I do wrong? Where did I make a mistake? How could have this happened? You know, we get, everybody looks at a lawyer and says, oh, lawyers, you know, have tough skin, thick skin. No, it bothers us. Number one, we're members of the community. Right. You know, our families live here. Right. My children and my grandchildren live here. I don't want crazy criminals walking the streets. Right? But, you know, I've represented very few bad people in my career. Very few. Less than a handful. The vast number of people, and probably the vast number of people in jail, today in prison are not bad people. They're not, God didn't make evil, right? So most of these people, our friend involved with Emanuel, not my friend, but the person who was involved in Emanuel being an exception, that's an evil. That's evil. But I can tell you the people who I have represented, there's a very narrow portion of their life in which they didn't do well. And in most cases, I can take that bad decision, that wrongful decision, that wrong violation of law, morality, violation of the legal law, and I can look and see, how did we get there? Was it alcohol? Was it drugs? Was it greed? Was it a personality situation, a mental health issue? I can more times say this is what caused that. And this is how, to prevent it from happening again, we can address this medically. We can address this with alcohol counseling. We can address it with drug counseling. We can address it with mental health counseling, whatever that issue is. Sex, same thing. You know, you've got a sexual malfunction somewhere in your mind. You're acting out on. So there are alternatives to just punishment. Now, do I believe in punishment? Yes, I do. The punishment may be not for the individual as much as it is to show society, to tell us all that, you know, you have this type of behavior, you're going to be punished. So that's a necessary ingredient. But there's far more to the legal system than just bad guy punishment. You know, because then all you're doing is recycling. And then you're not getting to the root of the problem. And thank God we have judges now who really understand that, particularly in state court, which is where the volume of cases are. You've seen a real change in the attitude of certain members of the judiciary to understand, to have the concept of it's not the headline in the newspaper, 18 years in prison or 25 years in prison. They think through that. They say, what are we going to do so 5 years from now we're not going to have the same individual, you know, prying on the community with their acts. So I know that was a long question.
You know, no worries.
But I enjoyed being with you so much.
Oh, likewise. And I got to work on that battery, but we'll talk some more.
Good enough.
I appreciate this greatly.
Good to be with you again.
Well, likewise. Yeah, man.